Well, hello kinesiology students, it's Mr. Krente here, and today we're going to be talking about biomechanical principle number 2 and number 3, the principle of maximum force, and then the principle of maximum velocity. Each of these principles allows us to put as much force into an object or a movement as we can, or as much velocity into a movement as we can. And both of those are important for many different sports and many different activities. However, keep in mind before we jump in here that they're not necessary for all sports or all movements. Sometimes we need a little bit of touch if we're throwing an object, shooting an object, etc. But sometimes we do want as much force or as much velocity on an object, on ourselves, as we possibly can. So, looking at these two concepts, what is the principle of maximum force? It is the use of all the joints that can be used. When we want to produce maximum force in an activity, we want to use all of our joints that are available to us to be able to use. If we use fewer joints, we produce less force. When we use more joints, we produce more force. Why? Well, it's pretty simple. When we use more joints in a movement, we use more muscles in the movement as well. More muscles, more of that actin-myosin interaction, and we get more force from our muscles. So more joints equals more muscles equals more force. Practically speaking, you can see this when we're doing different types of movements. And the more we practice, the more we realize that we need to use more joints when we're doing a specific movement. We also teach people to use more joints when we're doing a specific movement in order to generate maximum force. For example, I've got a weight here, and if I'm doing a proper clean, we know that we use all the joints that we possibly can in order to generate that maximum force. So I'm going to be using my legs, my hips, and the whole chain all the way up to my shoulders, my elbow, my wrist, in order to do a proper clean. If you've seen someone do an improper clean, then you know that they tend to not use a lot of their legs, and they tend to maybe not use their shoulders as much, and they tend to use a lot of their elbows and their wrists, and they definitely don't get the amount of force that they need. When we teach people to do things properly, we tend to have to point out, oh, you're not using this joint, or you're not using that joint. When you teach a student to throw, if you've seen a lot of toddlers or very young children throw, you realize they don't use all the joints available to them. It's a lot of like this movement where they lean back and maybe they'll use their shoulder or their elbow, and that's about it, right? And very early thrower. If they're not taught, if they don't learn how to throw properly, then they'll just continue to do this kind of motion in different ways. We know to use all the joints. You can throw properly using your ankle, your knee, your hip, twisting at the torso, elbows, shoulders and elbows, wrist, fingers. Those are the joints that we know we can utilize for a throw, and in order to get maximum force on a throw, we use all of those joints. But again, it has to be a learned thing. We teach more joints, more force. I know for a lot of students, especially young children, to teach this turning of your body, not facing your target, but turning sideways to your target, allows that torso rotation that adds more force to your throw, to your soccer kick, to your hockey slap shot, etc. Right? That's not something that just comes naturally to a lot of people. It has to be taught. So, maximum force is the use of all the joints that can be used. More joints, more muscles, more force. Principle number 3, biomechanical principle number 3, is maximum velocity. And it's similar but different. If we use joints from largest to smallest at peak speed, we generate maximum velocity on an object. And if we use all the joints that can be used, you'd think, oh, that's great. I'll just use all my joints. I'll get that torso twist. I'll use my legs and I'll throw that ball all at once, right? I throw all my joints all at once. Well, I've used all the joints that can be used. But we know that we don't generate maximum velocity on a throw when we do that. There's like a sequence to the throw. You'll use certain joints before you use other joints. When you kind of slow down a motion, you'll see joint, X, joint Y, joint Z, all the way through a proper motion. Now, what are those joints? What is the sequence? Well, it's the largest muscle groups to smallest. When I initiate, let's say, a throw, a baseball pitch, I'm gonna utilize a lot of that lower body, quadriceps, hamstrings, glute max, all of those larger muscles to initiate that extension. And then I'm going to be pushing out from my ankle, knee, hip. Then I'm gonna get this torso rotation, another large muscle group involved, and I'm gonna turn, and then my arm is gonna be activated from the shoulder, my deltoid, my tricep extension at the elbow, my small wrist flexors all the way down to those even smaller finger flexors at the very end, okay? When we do that, when we go largest to smallest with our joints, we create kind of like a whip action to our movement. And if you've ever utilized a whip before, if you just like pick up the whip and there's like throw it right down, then it doesn't really do anything. But you gotta like pick it up and then snap it, and then the process kind of goes through, and at the end it's a really big snap. Or if you've ever like snapped a towel before, you know that it's slow and then you pull it back. Not that I recommend trying, but that's the idea of this principle. It's largest, and then we're going to transfer the force from those larger to slightly smaller to slightly smaller to slightly smaller to slightly smaller muscle groups, joints, and create that whip-like action that's actually going to put more velocity on the ball than if we just did them all at once. That's the principle of maximum velocity. Now we say largest to smallest at peak speed. So even within that sequence of largest to smallest, you want to be able to do it at the most force you possibly can. So there's a certain angle of each muscle group that will give you the greatest amount of force. If you pause or stop that movement and get that force transferred to the next joint, then you're going to utilize that muscle at peak force and transfer that force to the next muscle, which will, again, you try to contract at peak force, and then as you transfer all the way down what we call the kinetic chain, all the way down to the end, then you will transfer all that force into the object, and that's how you get that, largest to smallest at peak speed. So I accelerate, and then I stop, and then I accelerate, and then I stop, and then I accelerate, and then I stop, and accelerate in a very, millisecond type of scenario, but we actually do that when we generate maximum velocity. We call this the summation of joint forces. So we add up our joint forces and try to hit each sequence at peak speed. So here's my graph. So the amount of force I'm generating over a certain amount of time, force times time, we'll talk about that later. But the sequence is obviously legs, hip, shoulder, elbow, wrist, very simply for, let's say, a throw. Now, as I do my throw, if I time it over a certain amount of time and I transfer my force to the next area or muscle group too early, you can see that my adding up of forces is not that high. It's too early. So even if I have a lot of force in my next area, my next muscle group, because I'm transferring that force too early, I am not generating as much force as I possibly can. Similarly, if I do it too late in the sequence, my legs aren't at their peak force because I'm doing it too late, it does not add up to a high amount of force. But if I time it so that my legs are at peak force, and then I transfer it to my hips, torso twist at peak force, and then my shoulder at peak force, my elbow at peak force, my wrist at peak force, I'm going to have more force at the end of the throw. How do we get that peak transfer? Well, it's practice, it's instruction, and it's getting that timing that a great athlete will have. A great athlete,
Mr.
you'll see them.
Scott, please report to the main office.
Sorry
Mr.
about
Scott,
that.
to the main office.
You'll have that transfer at a peak time, and you'll see a great athlete look very smooth in their motions, and that smoothness comes over time from practicing the proper sequence and getting that timing, that feel for a throw just right. I'm talking about a throw for ease, but we could be talking about a kick. We could be talking about, a skating movement. We could be talking about any type of athletic movement you can think of that wants, maximum force and maximum velocity. That's how an athlete generates those peak forces and velocities. Hope you learned something. Thanks. Have a good one.